It is my pleasure to introduce Neal Shister to all of you. Shister, sorry. I just asked him a couple of seconds ago. Neal is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in several publications, including Time Magazine and the Miami Herald. He's taught at Hampshire College, Boston University, and George Washington University. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Ivory Coast from 1968 to 1970, and he lives here in Washington, D.C., with his wife Catherine and son William. This evening, he is going to talk about his new book, Radical Ritual: How Burning Man Changed the World. As both a journalist and a six-time participant in Burning Man, Neal makes a case for the importance of the event, both as a place where new social paradigms are constructed as the world around it unravels, and as a contributor to the world with its postmodern ethos of 60s era humanism and digital era wizardry. Kirkus Reviews writes that Radical Ritual is a focused insider's guide to Burning Man and a posthumous nod to its intrepid creator. Everyone, let us all welcome Neal Shister.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Truly, I don't believe this book is really here. It's been such an arduous journey, but I'm just delighted today's the publication date, so I'm surprised at how excited I actually am. I'm going to try to set Burning Man in a context today. I'll give an overview of the event, a little bit of its history, a brief profile of the man who founded it and died last year. Then an analysis of the culture, which is a tad erudite, but the point of it is to try to locate the seriousness of Burning Man as well as its frivolity. And then ultimately, a few examples of why I contend that Burning Man has changed and is likely to continue to change the world. A few days ago, I was listening to a podcast with Megan Rapinoe, the heroine of the World Cup, and she was talking about the campaign to get equity for women in the soccer world. It was imperative, she said, to change the formula that the U.S. Soccer Association has been using to subvert their arguments for equality. And that argument essentially was that women are incapable of generating the same amount of revenue that men can. Hence, they're not worthy of equal pay. So the conversation then shifted to a talk about how she had dressed and looked during the parade in Manhattan and how spiffy she was and how she wore fabulous-looking sunglasses and what a stylish creature she is. And she responded only half-jokingly, well, you got to be cool to shake up the status quo. You got to be cool to shake up the status quo. And it hit me in hearing that remark that this is exactly what Burning Man has done. It's gone cool enough to shake up the status quo. From one lonely soul living on the margins, it's grown into an event that's easily attracted more than 1 million attendees. VIPs and celebrities show up, but more importantly, tens of thousands of middle-class types have now got Burning Man on their bucket lists. In a word, it has indeed gone cool. Cool enough, perhaps, to accomplish what has long been the mission of the founders: empowering people, ordinary individuals, to believe in their unsuspected powers, their capacity to change fundamental paradigms about individual agency and social community. It's gone cool enough to get people to take themselves more seriously than they might otherwise have, and many have taken that seriousness into the real world and have begun to change it. This is all happening in an idiom that's just perfectly suited for our times. An idiom that combines the serious and the sublime, that doesn't take itself seriously yet at the same time has a steadfast sense of purpose. And it's happening at a moment when it's most urgent and most needed, when liberal humanism itself is in dire risk. I hadn't really thought exactly in these terms until Rapinoe's comment. But afterwards, all the pieces that I've been working on for the past several years suddenly fit. This is exactly how Burning Man is changing the world. By going cool, by drawing people who otherwise would never be there, by empowering them with a sense of possibilities that they never previously took seriously, all in the name of what has essentially been a lost sense of community. So what exactly is Burning Man? That's usually the question I get in DC, or at least it was until last year's Renwick show. Before that, though, it was known mostly in hipster and millennial circles. Those who had heard of it largely knew it through two endlessly recycled media memes as either sex-crazed druggies out of their minds running around naked or obscenely rich one-percenters corrupting the purity of the event by paying $40,000 apiece to rough it in concierge camps with celebrity chefs. Now, neither one of these two factoids is wrong. Both are accurate, but they don't begin to capture the complexity and diversity of what's going on. There is so much more. Yes, indeed, you will see hippies and Russian plutocrats out there, but you'll also see hordes of ordinary folks in the process of experiencing their lives in unfathomable and novel ways that they never could have imagined before. The subtext to the book I've spent these years writing is that Burning Man has been done a disservice by its popular image. Were it a product, it would scream out for rebranding. No wonder, though, that it's hard to understand. It's a singular phenomenon, not an entertainment festival, although it's often compared to Woodstock or Coachella, but those comparisons are mistaken. Nor is it a religious revival, although it has spiritual aspects, nor a political convention, though many in the global community refer to themselves as a nation without a country. It's something I contend never seen before, totally sui generis, without precedent, something, dare I say, that will prove to be historically significant. The best way to start to understand Burning Man is to think of it as a gathering of the kindred and the curious. 75,000 of them every year. The size could easily double if the Bureau of Land Management allowed it to. These people turn a barren, hostile environment, Nevada's Black Rock Desert, into the third largest city in the state, Black Rock City, with all kinds of things that constitute a city: an urban design and street grid, a Department of Public Works, keepers of the peace, cafes and bars, marching bands and an orchestra, multiple radio stations and newspapers, medical facilities, and, most importantly, 1,001 events ranging from the serious to the gastronomic to the absurd and, indeed, the erotic. All of these events and services are provided by and for the community, voluntarily, at no charge. In the parlance of Burning Man, they are gifted. No cash changes hands, no barter. The only two things you can buy on Playa are ice, mandated for reasons of public health by the state of Nevada, and coffee, a tradition dating back to the first days on the desert when there was always a pot of coffee on the fire at Central Camp. Then, after all this splendor, after a week, many of the structures and arts projects are burned in ceremonial fires. The people depart. Just as the city arose from nowhere, so does it disappear, leaving no trace behind, as if it never were, until next year. But Burning Man is more than the event. It's also a nonprofit, the Burning Man Project, a $45 million a year operation. It's an international network of autonomous associations and events that owe their inspiration to Black Rock City, dozens of them, ranging from South Africa to Shanghai to Brazil to France, where, in a witty twist on the theme of fire, the gathering is called creme brulee. Burning Man is more than spectacle. It has spun off entities actively engaged in the real world. Burners Without Borders provides emergency relief and community infrastructure following natural disasters. BlackRock Labs is developing sustainable energy prototypes that can be inexpensively implemented by people in underdeveloped countries as well as in the developed world. Those are two examples, and I'll mention a few more later. But lest you dismiss me as a zealot, I want to tell you a little bit about my personal history. I never wanted to attend Burning Man in the first place, and to this day, I resist calling myself a burner. My wife, Kate, who's sitting over here, this beautiful woman, drove that train, announcing in 2013 that she had bought 2 tickets, hopefully for both of us, and she hoped I would join, but she made it clear that she was going regardless of what I decided. I went kicking and screaming, protesting to the end, trying at the last minute to talk her into going to Tahoe instead of Black Rock City. She wouldn't. When I returned home, however, a week later, 10 days later, my friends wondered how it was. Best trip I've ever taken was my answer, and I've traveled lots of exotic places. Kate and I have returned. It was 6 consecutive years since then, and now we're preparing for our 7th burn as we speak. That's how interesting it is. Black Rock City is endlessly fascinating. As much as anywhere I've ever been, it's filled with wondrous sights, interesting people, memorable food, and unique experiences, ranging from spectacular sunsets to going too many days without a shower. To get Burning Man, to understand it, it's necessary to understand Larry Harvey, the man who started the whole thing and remained its de facto face until his death last year. I liken his journey to one of Joseph Campbell's mythological heroes, an adopted child who knew nothing about his birth parents, an outsider in a family of emotionally rigid Dust Bowl refugees who had taken up residence in Oregon, a loner desperate for companions, a visionary possessed by a social ideal of community. Many in his Burning Man circle were in awe of his book knowledge, his intellect, his vision. Others were less charitable. Larry Harvey was many things and almost always well-loved, but decidedly not a saint. He referred to himself preeminently as a social engineer. In my book, I call him a mythic trickster. Harvey's original burn, the very first Burning Man, occurred in 1986, and it happened like this. He had spent the previous several years heartsick and chronically depressed, at periods unable to get out of his bed, after a romantic breakup. As he told me the tale one morning, he arose from his stupor one day, determined to heal. His last memory of joy before the depression was a summer solstice campfire on Baker Beach in the shadow of the Golden Gate with his ex-girlfriend and his young son. The solstice was approaching again. He called up a carpenter pal and he said, "Let's burn something on the beach." The request, even coming from Harvey, was so bizarre that his friend made him repeat it. They did indeed burn something. The structure did not represent anything. The only design requirement was that it could be stuck in the sand. As it burned, a handful of others in the vicinity wandered over to share the moment. Deeply touched and feeling empowered by such instant camaraderie, Harvey decided that he would do the same thing next year, this time with some advanced publicity. The publicity worked so well that several years later, the structure had an identity. It was a man, and it was 40 feet tall. And the event, now called Burning Man, was a red-letter night on the San Francisco's underground social calendar. Thousands of people showed up, many in a rowdy mood, so rowdy, in fact, that the police shut the whole thing down on the spot as a safety threat. But Harvey and a handful of cohorts, members of a San Francisco bohemian crew called the Cacophony Society, it's a tough word, weren't ready to give up. They took to the deserted Nevada Black Rock Desert, a place where they could drive fast, shoot guns, and burn stuff with no interference. The rest, as they say, is history. The distinguishing factor that makes Burning Man so different from other festival hangouts and makes it worthy of the attention of serious students of culture and history is that it itself has spawned a legitimate, sustainable culture. This didn't happen by chance. It was self-consciously shaped by Harvey, the social engineer. He was a devotee of the 19th century thinker William James, the famous founder of pragmatism. Pragmatism, which some students consider America's greatest and perhaps sole contribution to philosophy, pervades Burning Man. It's responsible for the fundamental premises of the community. In this system of pragmatism, beliefs, unlike, say, in Catholicism or communism, are not articles of faith. There is no divine code, no fixed truth. Instead, they are the bases for action. Their truth is measured by the success or failure of their consequences. To use a formal academic term, in this epistemology, change is constant, valued, and sought, not resisted and feared. Behavior is not to be judged, but allowed uninhibited free expression, so long as nobody's endangered. Out of this flux has come a Burning Man culture of values that aren't decreed from on high, but rather have sprung organically from the experience of the past 3 decades. At one point in its history, in order to provide some guidance to the various regionals and the new flocks of people that were coming, Harvey reluctantly wrote down how the Burning Man culture worked. It's called the 10 Principles. And now I'm reading from the book. The 10 Principles are the closest thing Burning Man has to doctrinal catechism, a user's manual, a profession of faith. Find yourself in a controversy, say whether super rich turnkey camps should be allowed, and the argument will inevitably come down to Talmudic disputations about the whatness of Burning Man, debated according to the principles. There's no little irony in this. Their purpose was never to be consulted as revealed text. Rather than resolve disputes, they were meant to encourage them. Harvey codified the underlying logic to Burning Man without insisting that it be logical. They were meant to instill an ethos of responsibility capable of reining in a population that was rebellious by nature. But even a minimal agenda once written down, Harvey feared, would corrupt the delicate pragmatic balance of the culture, which he called ritual without dogma. He kept insisting that Burning Man is an experiment that wasn't done, that it had to keep going forward. Finally, persuaded by his colleagues that it was necessary, he sketched out in a schoolboy's notebook the premise that informs the whole venture. Quote, "My principal intention as an artist is to create a ritual culture which is accessible to people living in non-traditional society. To accomplish this, I have devised, directed, and supported art with the following characteristics." And here, taken from the principles, are some of those characteristics, beginning with the first one and arguably the most important, radical inclusion. And I'm excerpting from the text of the principles, but radical inclusion is defined as this: anyone may be a part of Burning Man. We welcome and respect the stranger. Gifting is another of the principles. Burning Man is devoted to acts of gifting. Gifting does not contemplate a return or an exchange for something of equal value. Decommodification. Quote, "In order to preserve the spirit of gift giving, our community seeks to create social environments that are unmediated by commercial sponsorships, transactions, or advertising. Radical self-reliance is a principle. Radical self-expression is a principle. When Harvey came back and read the 9 principles to his colleagues, they thought that they were quite remarkable, but they said, in only mock jest, Moses had 10. Harvey went home and came back the next day with the 10th principle, the one he was astounded that he had forgotten, and the one that he thought was just central to all other actions. Immediacy. Quote, "We seek to overcome barriers that stand between us and a recognition of our inner selves, the reality of those around us, participation in society, and contact with the natural world exceeding human powers. No idea can substitute for this experience, and the key to having this experience is the immediate response to whatever is in your environment at the moment it occurs." So these were the principles. This is the essence, the infrastructure of the culture. So where does this leave us with respect to changing the status quo? Is there any basis for suggesting that Burning Man has indeed changed the world or might be in the process of changing it? I offer 3 suggestive arguments. The first is its unique art. On my first trip to Burning Man, I was overwhelmed by the art on display. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, and I look at lots of art. I said this to Kate, the phrase that became the inspiration for writing Radical Ritual. What Florence was to the Renaissance, Black Rock City is to a genre of artistic and cultural creation yet to be named. It was clear to me that something absolutely extraordinary was going on. As those who visited the Renwick saw, the art of Burning Man is bold, unexpected, awe-inspiring, whimsical, and fun. It combines large-scale industrial constructs with high-tech, with sound and light, including patterns triggered by algorithms that take their cue from surrounding crowd vibrations, which is true. The bold departure is not just in form, but also function. This stuff is meant to be communal in both its creation and its use. The crews that contribute to its construction are as acclaimed as the lead artist. Objects are meant to be touched, climbed, entered, slept in, danced upon. Burning Man's aesthetic is a bold departure from the staid art establishment. The role of art is neither to be coveted nor studied, but rather participated with. And the world has caught on. The foremost example I refer you to is the Hudson Yards development in Manhattan. How many of y'all have seen it? I mean, a few of you. The Hudson Yards development in Manhattan, which is just above Chelsea. It is the most valuable real estate in the United States. At its centerpiece, its crowd magnet, stands something called the Vessel. Massive stairs, 15 stories of vertical ascent, stairs to nowhere that are crowded with climbers night and day, simply drawn to it and compelled to climb it and interact with it and have relationships or interactions with others who are doing the same. This vessel, these stairs at the center of Hudson Yards are straight out of Burning Man. The second argument I'd put out there for its significance and for its potential historical consequence is an approach to participatory governance. We're seeing around us now how much people crave community, how much we want opportunities to physically and emotionally own our environments. We see it in the politics, we see it in residential developments, we see it on psychiatrists' couches, I suspect. One aspect of this kind of owning of one's environment is to be able to have rich, spontaneous, serendipitous social interactions that partake of immediacy. Another is being able to participate in the creation of spaces where one lives, gathers, works, and recreates. This I am calling the movement for a new commons. Burning Man is a playbook in this new commons. It is a playbook in how to do this. This is its raison d'etre. Silicon Valley startups picked up quickly on Burning Man as a model of collaborative governance and maximizing resource utilization. The very first Google Doodle, those cartoons that show up on the search homepage, was an homage to the Man, a sketch that Larry Page drew of Burning Man. It was an out-of-the-office message from Brim and Larry Page and the rest of their tiny crew, which was still in the garage at that time, telling anybody who happened to stumble on the site that they were out of the office and at Burning Man. The Burning Man has been called the national holiday of Silicon Valley and the techies. No less an august body than the U.S. Conference of Mayors similarly has acknowledged Burning Man's significance and its expertise in placemaking. At the convention 2 years ago, they invited a contingent from the project to walk the delegates, the mayors, through the Burning Man approach to creating community, hoping perhaps that this example they could derive principles from this example to have ways to approach urban redevelopment in new and different perspectives that emphasize the human interactions. So that's number 2 that I think we'll see. And finally, and in conclusion, number 3, Burning Man affords the world a contemporary way to cleanse the spirit. At the core of Burning Man, on the grounds, on an axis with the man, is the temple. It is the marquee attraction on Playa. This is a meditative space, tranquil amidst the commotion, where people come to purge themselves of pain. On its walls, they inscribe messages, affirmations of love, grants of forgiveness, pleas for pardon or hope. They deposit hurtful memorabilia from their past, like the wedding gown from a failed marriage. Then, as the final act of the year, the temple burns. And with it, all that sorrow and regret goes up skyward in swirling dust devils. It provides a kind of symbolic welcome to new beginnings. Comparable temples have been constructed various places in the United States and elsewhere, including Northern Ireland, where it was commissioned to offer reconciliation to Catholics and Protestants in Derry. At my first burn, I camped with an ex-Marine who fought in Iraq. He was a troubled man. For the first few days, he wore a checkered black and white Arab keffiyeh, a souvenir, he told me, of his first kill. Then one day it was gone. I asked what happened. He had told me he had taken it to the temple, along with a folded American flag. And on the wall above these 2 pieces, he wrote, "To the brother who I couldn't bring home, and to the brother I kept from going home." That, I suggest, is the power of Burning Man. On that note, then, I conclude and I submit my case in Megan Rapinoe's terms. I believe it's cool enough to change the status quo. Thank you. Questions? Everybody's got questions about Burning Man.
No problem. That's all right. That Burning Man spirit here at the microphone, too. So, well, thank you very much. I have 2 sons, and I'll be anxious to tell them about it. At least one of them has been to Burning Man at least once, and I think they aspire to go back. I'm not sure. My question is really a 2-part question, but pretty much the same question. In your opinion, is there a trend in kind of the success of it over the years towards better, more and more successful, or perhaps the reverse? And the extension of the question really is, what do you see in the way of a risk that Burning Man will somehow head downhill in some sense because, I don't know, the management of it can't come to terms with each other, or it ends up being commercial, although it's clearly against the rules, against the ideas, or that it gets stale or something.
Well, the biggest risk is the Bureau of Land Management up the street, which has just imposed. It's in every 10 years, an environmental statement has to be developed for this area of federal land, the Black Rock Desert. The Bureau of Land Management, which is not sympathetic to this administration, and the Bureau of Land Management are not sympathetic to Burning Man. And the next document is now in the questioning phase, or whatever it's called. Those of you that understand this stuff, and they're asking for $10 million. They're asking that the entire area, this is a vast area, be surrounded with those Jersey barriers. They want everybody that comes through the gate to be, searched and verified, and that could destroy it like that. So that should be known now, and Burning. So number one, number two, it could be destroyed because Burning Man is not particularly solvent. Hard as that is to believe. About $45 million, give or take, comes through the coffers, but that largely goes to finance the next year's event. It's remarkable how slight it has in terms of cash reserve. So, and to I think your original question, what do I see? Something
trend.
The difference, the change now that I've seen, even just in the 6 years I've been involved. I've been lucky enough to be able to be in close quarters with the leaders of the project, is they're taking themselves and the project now much more seriously in terms of really having a global and substantive impact. The festival will go on. The festival will continue as it is. But Burning Man, I didn't mention this in the piece, but it's in the book, acquired a beautiful piece of land on the desert within 15 minutes of private land, close to where the festival takes place, called Fly Ranch, which has water and is just a spectacularly different than this on the other side of the mountains from the desert. And this is going to be a permanent installation, although nobody knows yet what they're going to do with it. And they're spending about 3-4 years searching out all kinds of things. And it may be an educational center, maybe a place to bring people that don't want to, leaders and opinion makers who don't want to go to the festival, but might come for, several days in comfortable circumstances. It may be a place where all kinds of artists gather. There's all kinds of things that can happen. The other great idea, which we want to do, is be able to develop some variation of a platform that enables this worldwide community, it's worldwide, to be able to not only interact with each other, but be able to derive benefits from each other, be able to collectively develop projects, and perhaps in this conversation, developing a cryptocurrency that will be able to be able to sustain this vast community insofar as cryptocurrencies can truly become, exchangeable commodities. That's in the book at length. So that's what they see going on. The festival itself, Burning Man as we know it, is pretty much locked in. I mean, it has momentum. It runs itself. It doesn't run itself, but I mean, it's got its vitality. It's got its order. It's now got an image out there. It's the next phase that the leadership is truly thinking about. And now they've taken on a development director, which they never had before. They now have a much more a more tiered bureaucracy that's much more agile. But it's at risk. It's very much at risk, both from the BLM and one bad year and there's no money.
Yeah.
So that's my answer.
Thanks. Very.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned in the earliest minutes of your talk that that Burning Man was started in 1986, I think was the year you said.
Correct.
I hadn't known when it had started. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when I think of 1986, I think of the Reagan era, sharp rise in the number of people incarcerated and the drug war and all that. Do you think that Burning Man could have started earlier or later, and it was just a coincidence that it started then, or do you think it was something of a unique product of its time?
I think it's absolutely a convergence of a time and a place, and I read about this at length in the book too. And the time is precisely as you noted. It's the first wave of the counterculture, particularly in San Francisco, has ebbed. And so, and there's a line in the book, the generation that was rising at that point didn't want to change the system; they wanted to own it. And so but there were still vestiges from older people that had participated in this remarkable bohemian culture in San Francisco, which I also go at length to describe. That's going on. At the same time, the tech revolution's just starting. I mean, in 1986, I think, is the year when IBM comes out with its first personal computer, and it's something like 10 pounds, and it's a disaster. But that sort of dates it. And the technology, which is up the peninsula or down the peninsula from San Francisco, that pervades it as well. And it's this convergence of kind of the humanism of the last counterculture loyalists and the technological wizardry of the tech folk. That comes together, and both see in the other something they vitally need. The humanists suddenly are empowered by all this stuff, and the tech kids, and they're kids at this point, most of them, the tech types are acquainted with the idea that there's more to the human spirit than bits and bytes. And so that's the way it works. In terms of the politics and Reagan et al., it doesn't really figure. It starts out, the first line of the book is something to the effect that nobody had any idea this was going to happen, particularly the people that did it. I mean, this guy was heartsick. He was difficult. He had virtually no job. But a very smart guy and a very charismatic in his own way. And he was bummed out. Hey, Grover. And he was bummed out. And he just wakes up this is a story he told me. Now, he's also politically skillful or duplicitous, depending upon one's point of view. And stories changed a lot. But this is a story he told me in his apartment when we were chit-chatting. He was sitting in bed reading Freud, and he looked at Freud as a father he never had. He was essentially trying to do self-analysis. And the big move was when he discovers Kohut, who is the founder of narcissism, and suddenly realizes that he was a narcissist, and that sort of starts opening up his mind about how he's gotten into this strait. And he wakes up, so he tells me that one morning, and he's in pain. This guy is in pain. And one morning he gets up and he tells me that for the first time in months, he didn't feel bad. And he decided he liked the way that felt. And he was going to figure out how to get that feeling back. So he calls up his friend, and at this point, Larry Harvey is earning his living as a sort of gardener, a landscape guy, but it's a hand-to-mouth living. And he calls up his pal, and they say, let's go burn something. And he's got a trellis in his scrap wood and a trellis Harvey has. And his pal's a carpenter. And so they use the trellis and they hammer stuff. And it had to be able to be stuck in the sand so they could light it. That was the whole point. And so it begins and then suddenly, depending on who you listen to, Harvey has a romantic moment, an apotheosis. He writes about it in the most elaborate terms of people coming together in that moment and partaking of human spirit. His pal who was with him says, I think they were just coming to get warm. But but Harvey goes with his instincts and he sells it. Burning Man exists because of this guy, Larry Harvey. And other folks whom he draws into his orbit, but that's how it starts, and that's how it happens.
Does this work? Yes. Hi. So my first burn was also in 2013, but I don't have a book to show for it. So my question for you is, when did you decide, I know you're a writer, when did you decide to write this book, and how did you approach the inner circle and get all of that access?
It's a great story that I love to tell. So the 40-foot man, on top of it's the landmark that you navigate by on the playa. I have no sense of direction. I'm always getting lost. But so you can figure out where you are by the man. And the burning of the man takes place on Saturday night, the second last night, the night before the temple burns. So the first burn, we're out there, and Sean's here. Where is Sean? Sean was with us. And the man burns, and it's a big, dusty night. And we're lost. We're just totally lost. We have no idea where we are. So we're walking through coming back from the burn, and we're walking through a dust storm. And then it sort of breaks, and we're standing right next to what's called First Camp, which is where the founders stay, where the VIPs stay, where the notable guests stay. And being a reporter and being a nosy guy and, not being constrained by social protocol, I said, let's go in. I want to see what it looks like. Well, Sean and his wife were with us, and they were far too polite, and they immediately went off. And poor Kate, who's had these experiences more than once, reluctantly follows me in. And if you've those of you that have been reporters, the trick to getting in where you're not supposed to be is to walk in like you belong. And I've had some practice. So we walk in, and there's a fire pit going. This is how I did the book. There's a fire pit going, and I don't know who was sitting around there, but we just sort of sit down like we belong. And somebody's kind of passing around grilled cheese sandwiches, which is one of the traditions at First Camp. And I take one, and gradually we get into a conversation with the person sitting next to us, who turns out to be a woman named Rosie Lila. And at that point, Rosie's role at Burning Man was external liaison with people like the BLM and people of importance, and Rosie was friendly to us, and I think she was most impressed because my wife has a prestigious job in Washington, and Rosie was out there looking for networks, and we became friends. And I said, this is intriguing. And then we came back, and I thought, well, I wouldn't mind writing a book about this. So Rosie told the woman who runs Burning Man, Marion Goodell, that I was interested. And we went out to San Francisco, and Marion, we had a meeting, and Marion and I and Kate just sort of, the chemistry worked. But, and so by that, and then what I wanted to write about was exactly what they were thinking about. I wanted to write about how do you export Burning Man culture so it has a social impact in the real world. And that is exactly what they were starting to think about. And then I had to pass the Larry Harvey test, and I write about that in the book. So I still hadn't met Harvey. And Rosie calls me up one day and says, Harvey's going to be in New York. He's talking at Columbia, some fancy, doodah, and we'll set you up the next morning if you want to meet him. So I go up to New York. I see the speech. I see the stuff. I go to the coffee house up in Harlem, and I'm waiting for Harvey, and he shows up, 20 minutes late. And he was not an affable, warm guy. I mean, he's the kind of guy that until you show him you're not a fool, he assumes you are. And that's intimidating. So it's like I think the whole project's collapsing right at the beginning. And then somehow Harvey mentions his son. And I have a daughter the same age as Harvey's son. And I mentioned my daughter. And that moment and Harvey is a very different man when he talks about his kid, was a very different man. And the fact that we were both fathers and essentially both the same age, I think was the link that allowed me to write the book, because then Harvey became very, very supportive of the book. And from then on, and then it was a lot of reporting, tremendous amount of reporting, lots of trips to San Francisco, lots of calls to people all over the country. It was hard work, but that's how I got in.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Where are you camping this year?
IMU. No, what am I? 3SP, excuse me.
Third space place.
Third space place.
And we're around 415 and
Are you going? Anybody going to Burning Man? Oh, very cool. Oh.
Great talk, Neal. Thanks. Could you say a little more about like what a day is like at Burning Man?
Well, I can tell you what my day is like. I get up very early, and I don't stay up late at night usually. So I get up. Most people do, but I don't. Or many people do. I don't. I usually get up quite early, 6-ish maybe even, and you ride around and you navigate by bicycle. And I ride my bike way on the periphery. There's a fence that keeps you, a fence that's pretty far out, and you can't go on the other side of the fence. And there are people that camp right at the fence and stuff like that. And I would ride my bike around in the quiet of the day. And then, well, you should come up and tell us, what's a typical day like? And then... Oh, I was the ice guy. Will and I were the ice guys at our camp. We would be. You have to get your ice every day virtually, and so then I'd come back to camp. We have a small camp, 20 people, and breakfast was always a big deal. The guy brings somebody in our camp is a real coffee aficionado, and he's a obsessive compulsive about his coffee. So we always have great coffee. And then Will and I would go get ice, and then essentially what I would do is go out and look at the art, or alternatively, there's a booklet that's published. I mentioned the 1001 events. And all the camps sponsor various events. And they're fascinating. They're just anything you can imagine. And
like what?
How to play the ukulele, how to have sex on your first date and not have herpes, how to make paper, TED Talks. Kate gives something. Kate gives us something on negotiating for women. That's usually popular. So and the art, and then it's getting hot all the time. So by 1 o'clock, you kind of want to get out of the heat. But we go out and look at the art, and the art boggles the mind. So we go out and then come back and then look for shade in the heat of the day. And one of the best things at Burning Man, one of the camps, their gift to the community is a lot of hammocks underneath a huge shade shelter with fans around, and they circulate, giving you drinks. And those hammocks there's waiting lines for those hammocks in the middle of the day. And then preparing meals is a big deal. Not a big deal, but it's a collaborative deal. And then the night, it's a different world. The art is different by night than it is by day. And those who want to dance, those who want to go to music, those who want to, do whatever they want to do it. And that's essentially the rhythm of my days. Mm-hmm. And what I love most about it, though, is you end up sitting next to somebody or getting in a conversation with somebody. You don't have any idea who this person is, but you sort of have a beginning, but there's an intimacy. Bridget. There's an intimacy and a kind of warmth just by virtue of being there. I mean, and you end up in remarkable conversations. And you find out these are amazing people. One of the guys I ended up talking to is a NASA guy who's in charge of the bioethics of NASA. And I write about him in the book and stuff like that. But it happens and they're not just the famous people. There's some guy who I ended up in a punk camp one morning with these guys, and it was so much fun to hang out with them. So Harvey was right. I mean, this notion of being in your own body and yourself, and the immediacy of accepting whatever's going on without laying on a lot of value judgments or stuff is remarkable. It works remarkable things and if we can create a context that can sustain that in Washington or in this bookstore for that matter, it may have vast implications.
I think Washingtonians think more burning tree than that's the problem.
Any other? Grover, you want to say a few words or no? Yeah? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe. Excuse me.
No problem, Neal. Thanks, Neal. That was great.
Thanks, Joe.
2-time burner here. Last time we got to write it 20,000 pound mechanized bison around the desert. So that was pretty cool. My question is, I would love to know your thoughts around kind of the struggle Burning Man has had as it's grown and become bigger, and how it balances that with truly being radically inclusive. Now, tickets are $400, $500. Everybody who's bought a ticket online knows it's very competitive. And if you get through the queue, you definitely buy 2 tickets and a vehicle pass for $1,000. And because you have to, if you want to make sure you go with a friend, etc. So I know one of the tenets is radical inclusion. And I believe Burning Man is trying to be as radically inclusive as it can be, but I also understand that as it grows to an event of 70,000 people, that becomes, you can't just have anybody can come in. You have to have some sort of guardrails around it. So I'd love to hear just your thoughts around how that.
Well, that's one of the existential questions that defies easy answers, and I'm sure that this is the stuff of many conversations at the project headquarters. The curse of popularity, the reality of the impact of money, what you say is quite true, and I think I believe they're experimenting with ways to offer scholarship tickets or free tickets, and I think that having Fly Ranch is going to provide a lot more options. So they'll be able to bring people, be able to go who might not otherwise who can't go to the event itself, and they're also aggressively sponsoring the regionals. I mean, not sponsoring, but supporting, and those are legitimate alternatives. But what you say is quite true. It's expensive. The carbon footprint in going there is, and one of the ways Black Rock Labs started, it was started by a guy who was an environmental scientist and political activist who was offended by the carbon footprint of getting to Burning Man. And so they started doing all kinds of stuff to make sustainable power much more accessible. But it's not a what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a solution to all things. It's not a Pollyanna place. It's not a panacea. I mean, but it's so rich in social potential, and the challenge to those of us that believe in it is to extract stuff from it and plant it in the real world and see what arises. Plan it not necessarily as a festival or an entertainment, but as ways to recreate an impoverished downtown, ways to educate people, self-education. I mean, one experiment out there was one of the first opportunities and first trials in using crowdsourcing of public health information. People willingly allowed themselves, they knew what was going on. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we can do, and it doesn't require a lot of money many times, and it doesn't require government approval. And that's that's the essence of Burning Man. People go out and they do something. They build a crazy car. They decide to, I don't know, something crazy, and they do it. And then and if it works and it's popular, it expands. And if it isn't, it's forgotten.
Simple
picking up. So I'll tell you how Burning Man has most impacted me. At one point, the Bureau of Land Management was trying to get Burning Man out. And they said it was that the environment could not sustain the event. And so Harvey et al. Said, we're going to leave this playa absolutely pristine, in exactly the way it was prior to our arrival. So they start generating a lot of public discussion, propaganda, branding for MOOP, matters out of place. Matters out of place means when you see something that's on the ground, or when you see, something that has to be picked up, what we would call garbage or litter, you do it. And at the end of Burning Man, for a couple of weeks, there are people that stay there and they go through the entire ground, picking up feathers, picking up beads, because we'll lose, the BLM is looking for a way to kick us out. And so MOOP, I now walk around Washington picking up stuff to the embarrassment of my son. But I mean, I just do it now because I started to think this is our communal land, and I'm not self-righteous about it, but it's our communal landscape. And something as tiny as that. I mean, that's an example. If we decided, all of us here, that we were going to form a MOOP club in Washington, and somebody decides they're going to sort of, give it some heft and legs, we could have a lot of Washington a year, 2 years, 3 years from now walking around picking up garbage. We could do it. And that's an example of how Burning Man's culture can inspire some guy like me to come in front of you and say, we could do that if we wanted to, if we could, And maybe that's my mission. But that's what I mean by the exportation of Burning Man culture.
Thanks, Neal.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Neal. So my question relates to several of the other questions, which is how will Fly Ranch, which is different environmentally and in other ways, how will they take the Burning Man ethos and have it and apply it there so that it's still, radical inclusiveness, gifting, whatever else?
Well, one of the most distinct things that I learned in my reporting here was how a decision is almost impossible to make at the level of the project, because every decision takes 5 times as long as it would elsewhere, and it's always debated ad nauseum in the context of the principles. And it also, historically, the governance principle of Burning Man has been a consensus, not a majority, but a consensus. And nothing was done until all the interested parties agreed with whatever the solution was. So Fly Ranch, which is an incredible asset, the organization was able to raise about $7 million in a reasonably short amount of time. And folks like the head of Cirque du Soleil, some tech folk, some real estate people, a guy who founded a hotel chain were the donors. But Harvey was insistent that there be no quid pro quo whatsoever with the donations. And so people that wanted to have something named after them, or they wanted some commercial relationship or some public alliance with Burning Man, that couldn't happen. But they got this money, and the site, there's hot springs on the site. And one of the hot springs has been called by National Geographic one of the 100 places to see before you die. And it's crystallized with all, it's like, and again, I describe it much better in the book, but it's crystallized with all these, I guess they're bacteria that have come up, or organisms, and it's colorful and gorgeous and tiered, and it's just wonderful. It's a beautiful place to be. Well, that's sort of what Fly Ranch is, as well as rattlesnakes, the worst mosquitoes imaginable, wild horses that you can't touch because they're federally protected. I mean, again, not paradise. So the question is, what are you going to do with this land, with this that has water on it, that's green, and that now Burning Man owns? And so it's not clear there's been a commitment that for the first several years, and we're probably in the last of those several years, they will listen to the land and listen to the community. That's all they're going to do. Listen to the land, listen to the community. But in the book, I describe an experience I had with the guy who's running Fly Ranch, the project. And he's an amazing guy. He grows up on a farm in Virginia, homeschooled, a very conservative Republican. He goes to Harvard, where eventually he's elected president of the class. After Harvard, he goes teaching. He gets a fellowship to Yale Law School, not as a lawyer, but to study. He's a big data guy. To study, look for relationships between Supreme Court decisions and corporate lobbies, I don't know what he did, but he did that. He ends up a long journey, but he ends up in San Francisco and gets the job as the head of the guy who's managing the Fly Ranch project. He's 35 maybe. So we're talking, and he starts telling me this story, and this is what his dream is. This is what he thinks might end up being really the contribution of Fly Ranch. I'm not a techie, so I'll blunder the description. But he says it's possible to develop a multi-tiered platform within which every decision that's going to be made and the allocation of work and the choices of options and the physical pictures of the land and the law that's relevant to that area that they have to contend with. A multi-tiered platform that will both allow decision-making and work allocation and comprehensive kind of visioning. And I said, does anything like that exist? And he said, no, there's bits and pieces that do that. There are work management programs, there are decision-making programs, but there's nothing that works on this scale. And he said that was one of the big reasons why he took the job. And this was one, and he said, imagine if we could develop this kind of a thing, and imagine if we could, imagine, and let's assume it's going to be open source, and imagine anybody that we want to do the MOOC project. And this platform will be applicable for us to figure out how we build a community. He sees this platform that they're developing as a prototype for the building and creating of intentional communities utilizing technology. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but that was his, we talked 2 years ago, so I don't know if this is still what he's into, but that was his dream. And that's a power, and if you've been around Burning Man at all, you know that could happen. I mean, everything at Burning Man is impossible. How can you take a 747 jet and bring it to the playa and have it as an art project how can anybody do that unless you're, the U.S. government or something? A group did that. They decided it would be a trip to take an old 747 and bring it to the playa. They did it. I mean, so the capacity of human energy to be collaboratively managed, if properly bounded by a culture of believable ethics, is out there. And God knows that's what we need now. I mean, with some exceptions, most of us are, looking for alternatives to the process, as it were. Does that help? Who asked that question? I forgot. Oh, Susan, is that an answer at all?
Oh, so I asked this question on my own terms rather than on behalf of the store, of course. This is more of a personal thing. You mentioned something about cryptocurrency and how the organization that runs or organizes Burning Man was considering using it to enable the festival to continue in the near future. Wouldn't you say that the use of cryptocurrency sort of contradicts the spirit of the original Burning Man festival?
I mean, I'm the last guy to ask about cryptocurrency.
Oh, okay.
I went to, and this is also in the book, I was invited as an observer to go to the Esalen Institute 2 months after a burn, where the intelligentsia of Burning Man had been brought together, as well as outsiders, to talk about how do you establish and develop creative communities in the world. One of the persons there was an expert on cryptocurrency. He's the founder of a cryptocurrency program at Harvard Law, and he's at MIT, and he's written a book called From Burning Man to Bitcoin. So the conversation was very preliminary, but the idea is compelling. I mean, and I'm sure that most of you know more about Bitcoins than I do.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I'll finish and then. I guess your point is that would be exclusionary or something?
No, I mean, I guess the only reason I ask is, so I have a couple of friends in the tech community, and at least for maybe 4 or 5 years, cryptocurrency has been seen by most people in my circles as either a joke or a means of sort of scamming people out of money. I know it's kind of a complicated subject that many different people have differing opinions about, but especially considering kind of the sort of emancipatory libertarian spirit of Burning Man, it seems a little odd.
I don't know about. I mean, I throw this out merely as I can't respond to any of that stuff because I really don't know much about it. Right. But I know it was discussed as an idea.
Okay.
So we are unfortunately out of time for questions, but I'm sure Mr. Shuster would be very happy to sign your books. So if you would like to form a line to the right of the table, we'll start the signing. Thank you everyone for coming, and let's give one more round of applause.